Okay, well, it is just past 12 noon, and respecting everybody's time, I'd like to welcome everybody to the Green Bylaws in Action, a webinar with a focus on the Okanagan region. And I'd like to begin by a land acknowledgement by saying that even though we are meeting today virtually, we're all joining from our home and work offices, places that are based on the traditional territories and unceded areas across BC. I'm fortunate and really grateful for the opportunity to live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I invite everyone to recognize the land that we stand on belongs to those who have lived here before and those who have made their homes along the shores and waterways that we now call the Pacific Northwest. So when you have a moment, please take a minute to acknowledge the traditional territory in which you live, and feel free to share this in the chat function on the Zoom. By means of hosting this webinar today, we hope to provide information for Indigenous, local, provincial, and federal governments to aid in the implementation of green bylaws in the areas known presently as British Columbia. My name is DG Blair, and I'm Executive Director of the Stewardship Center for BC. The Stewardship Center is a nonprofit organization with a vision to help British Columbians understand, enjoy, and sustain healthy ecosystems through stewardship. And as such, we're really happy to host the Green Bylaws Toolkit on our website and support its implementation across British Columbia. Before I move on to another couple of slides, I just want to mention that we are going to have the chat function on the right sidebar, and please use that for any questions. We'll have discussion and answer questions after all the speakers have presented. So please feel free to use that chat function. So if you haven't found it already, you can find the third edition of the Green Bylaws Toolkit on our website. You can just go to Stewardship Center /Green Bylaws. And now I would like to turn it over to our facilitator, Ione Smith. So Ione is a professional agrologist with a background in agricultural planning and land resource science. She founded Upland Agricultural Consulting in 2010, specializing in innovative agriculture and food security plans, climate change adaptation, and mitigation strategies. She's worked with Indigenous communities, governments of all levels, and non-governmental organizations. In addition to her consulting work, Ione currently serves as vice chair of the Agricultural Land Commission and is an instructor at Simon Fraser University, where she teaches community economic development approaches to food. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ione.
Thanks very much, DG. I'm just going to share my screen and pull up my slides. Here we go. And put it on slideshow. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see some familiar names in the list of people who are joining us today. I know a lot of you through different avenues of work that I've done in the Okanagan, mainly around agricultural planning, but nice to be here today in this capacity. So as you're aware, we're going to be talking about green bylaws, specifically around success stories for implementation and innovation. This was something that when we did the first round of webinars last year around general information about the Green Bylaws Toolkit, that participants indicated they would like to know more about how to implement some of them. So that's what we're focusing on today. I will just go over, I just have 2 slides to talk a little bit about the toolkit itself, and then I'll introduce our panel presenters. So the focus of the 3rd edition of the Green Bylaws Toolkit is really on the natural environment and green infrastructure. And green infrastructure has been defined in all sorts of ways, but for the purpose of this discussion and for the toolkit, we're really talking about natural and semi-natural areas with environmental and engineered features. And it can be thought of as that sum total of ecosystem elements that maintain biodiversity and functioning ecosystems. It can also be thought of as the foundation of communities, and it requires a network of connectivity to really thrive. Local governments can aim to plan and manage within their areas to enhance nature's ability to deliver a wide range of ecosystem services and to support biodiversity in both rural and urban settings, thereby providing economic, environmental, and societal benefits to everyone. This can be done through strategic planning to create a green infrastructure network, like some communities have done. It can also be done by protecting and enhancing areas on a case-by-case basis through the Green Infrastructure Network. And I didn't write the Green Bylaws Toolkit, so I can't take credit for it, but I will relay some of the nuggets of wisdom that Deborah Curran has bestowed upon me. And she always says that after, over 25 years of working in this field, she can really narrow it down to 5 critical best practices when it comes to a successful approach to green bylaws. Firstly, it's really important to take a nested approach. So looking from the regional plan down level to connectivity to specific local government official community plans, and then zoning bylaws, development permit areas, so that it goes from the regional down to the private property level. And I think Jing is going to talk a little bit about that layering approach, which is really important. And then the 3 key ingredients to making that happen, again, is the policy side, so planning and strategies, and also the regulatory piece, the bylaws. But that 3rd key ingredient is community buy-in and support, so that it's really important to create a culture of conservation on the ground within the community in order to ensure that some of these things that are in the books or on the table can then become implemented. The 3rd thing that Deb says is that it's really important to focus on ecological health at all scales. So going from just talking about individual property rights, no, not so much just at that scale, but looking at watershed management, for example, creating compact, efficient development for the entire community, protecting property and biodiversity at all different levels. The next thing that she says is important is to create ecosystem-based measurable performance indicators. These can be objectives or targets that have specific numbers attached to them. That SMART kind of SMART approach, for example, such as 95% of new development must occur within the urban containment boundary, or we're going to restore 5 kilometers of riparian habitat, something that that members of the public can really grasp and sink their teeth into, and that the local government can then report back on over time. And lastly, she says there's enough information and data out there. Not to say that we can't always do more research and look into things more, but there's enough data and information on the ground that the time to implement really is now. We've seen very good general guidelines with good results, but we don't need better information to make good decisions today. We just simply need to act. And so with that in mind, we've brought these 3 presenters together today. And the way that this is going to work is we're going to have each presenter speak for about 5 to 10 minutes. And then with whatever time is left over, we'll have a question and answer period. So if you do have questions during the presentations, we ask that you hold them into the end. If you're worried you're going to forget what your question is, you can type it into the chat, but we'll do our best to get through as many questions as we can at the end. Our first speaker is Jing. Jing is an environmental planner with the Regional District of Central Okanagan. She's a sustainability specialist, and her expertise lies in climate change adaptation, mitigation, environmental science, development planning, and engineering. This has enabled her to contribute to multiple local governments throughout her career. She's worked before for the City of Delta, Port Coquitlam, the City of Vernon, and now with the RDCO. And today her presentation will focus on the value and importance of layering within environmental policy. Next, we have Jen Miles. Jen is an environmental coordinator with the City of Kelowna. She reviews development proposals that affect Kelowna's natural environment development permit areas, which you'll get to learn about more today. She joined the city in 2021, but didn't have to travel far because she'd been with the RD of North Okanagan for 13 years working on watershed protection planning. And then our third speaker is Scott Boswell. Scott is a conservation specialist with over 20 years experience in environmental planning and community development. He's currently the program chair for the Okanagan Collaborative Conservation Program, where he leads landscape level planning initiatives in partnership with the Okanagan Nation Alliance to protect the region's biodiversity. He holds a bachelor's degree of science in environmental studies and a master's degree in environmental planning. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Jing. She's going to share her screen now. Looks good. You're just on mute. There you go.
I'm just trying to unmute myself. Thank you. Thanks for that wonderful introduction, Ione. And so great to see such wonderful attendance from everybody. Some of you can probably do this presentation better than I can. So anyways, I wanted to note that having fumbled my way through both the implementation end and the policy end of environmental protection over the last many years, I thought I'd take some time today to talk about this whole idea behind the benefits of layering for environmental protection. So my goal today is to convince you to think about, 1, what layering for environmental protection might look like, and 2, how it might benefit your community or organization. So here's my pitch. Layering for environmental protection provides a comprehensive and resilient approach for local governments to maintain its service delivery through green infrastructure. So you're asking, well, how? How so? Let's talk about some of the key benefits. So having access to a variety of policies, regulations, and incentives provides the most comprehensive set of options for protection. We all know that no two developments or projects are the same. And it's the age-old idea that the more options you have in your toolbox, the more likely you might have the right combination of solution for protection. And having a suite of mechanisms in place also provides a strong indication of the direction your organization has set and demonstrates consistency of having this common goal towards environmental protection. And this helps staff, planners, land use managers inform landowners of the significance of environmental protection during that development process. And we've all heard this before, as local governments build layers of protection, there is often this conception that this creates red tape and bureaucracy. I want to convince you that this is not necessarily the case. In fact, if exemption parameters and delegated authorities are implemented carefully, this can actually operate as layers of incentives to reduce process and expedite thoughtful development. And having a wide set and layered approach also help capture gaps. Having access to a wide set of mechanisms can provide a safety net to capture unexpected gaps that happen through changing policies, changing legal frameworks, and often changing ownerships on the landscape scale itself. All right, so these benefits sound great. What do they look like and how can they be implemented? I want to take a look at the aquatic ecosystem protection regime in the regional district here. We know that in the dry ecology of the Okanagan, aquatic habitats are critical for wildlife connectivity, ecosystem functions, water quality, supply, and we built layers of aquatic protection measures in place because of that. Firstly, the fundamentals, and as emphasized by the very first Green Bylaws Toolkit, ecosystem mapping is essential as a prerequisite to making effective use of regulations moving forward. So in the regional districts, we've completed sensitive habitat inventory mapping, we've completed sensitive ecosystem inventory mapping, foreshore inventory mapping. We've also worked with the OCCP with Scott on identifying some significant wildlife corridors that he'll talk about. And we're also actively working on a region-wide SCI update as we speak, actually. We know this data allows us to quantify what's important, where it is, and justify why we need these protection measures in place. So from here, the regional district has built a suite of policies and guidelines based on this data. I don't want to get into the details too much. I know Jen's going to get into DPAs a lot deeper, but specific to the RDCO, we have DPAs to protect, restore, and enhance aquatic ecosystems in place. This means that land disturbances within these sensitive areas require a DP review supplemented by professional reports. We direct development, the idea of developing a leaf strip that remains protected and undisturbed as part of the assessment process. And this is similar to the provincial streamside protection enhancement area, though the RDCO has chosen to go a step beyond that and exceed wrapper requirements by embedding this directly within our own process and going beyond that. We also have another couple of bylaw pieces of that play a part in this process. Specifically, our zoning bylaw contains floodplain regulations, which often work hand in hand to mitigate development impacts adjacent to water. And our procedures bylaw delegates DP approvals to staff in situations where work meets guidelines and recommendations. It also specifies security requirements and help implementation. And finally, we also rely on very comprehensive terms of reference for professional reports to ensure implementation. We utilize restrictive covenants for exemption, as well as additional protection when it's warranted. What do they look like when they're implemented? So let's look at these benefits. Sorry, I just lost my slide here. Translating these back to the benefits of what we had reviewed earlier, our comprehensive toolbox means that there's a greater chance that we're able to find the best combination of protection measures during development. Our STAG policies also demonstrates that the RDCO intention for aquatic system protection is meaningful and it's consistent throughout our policies. These also built incentives to avoid disturbances in sensitive areas by reducing process, reducing costs, and reducing the time associated with permitting when the right application comes to the table. And having experienced changing policies and standards and so forth, there's been more than a few times when these layered protection measures really have worked together to mitigate development impacts when something has changed. So let's talk about it, what this looks like. Most owners want direct access to the lake, probably for LF5 applicants. We see here as an example in the Okanagan, wants to build on the lake for environmental development permits in the aquatic ecosystem. And I'm sure a lot of other municipalities see this as well. So they have this preconception of what living on a lake might look like. They want to develop right next to the shoreline often when they first come in the door. So as an example, when we see plans like this, our pre-application discussions are really complex because of it. We use this as an opportunity to inform the landowner about the aquatic habitat, why it's important, and some of the risks that's associated with developing so close to that. We make it clear that while they can undertake a very onerous, time-consuming, and expensive process just to seek approval from multiple jurisdictions, it's still often unlikely to result in their favor. So as an alternative, they can make it a lot simpler just by respecting the aquatic protection area. They save money, they save time through this process. Or even better, they stay out of the sensitive area altogether. So this layered toolbox, this layered concept and approach has built some strong incentives for protection. And I'd say actually in most scenarios, the applicant we see will shift their original approach to simplify things for themselves. So some lessons learned along the way. No single regulation is perfect. In the handful of local governments that I only mentioned that I worked for, I've never landed in a single local government. I thought, well, everything is perfect. I don't want to change a thing. Instead, I'd urge you to not get stuck on perfection. Make the policies that you have work for you. So layering measures does not equal bureaucracy and redundancy. It can work as incentives. So back to our goal, if there's one idea that you can take away today with you, I'd like you to ask yourself, what tools do I already have in my toolbox? And how can I use these to work towards improving environmental protection in my community? So I've listed here some references that we have available to the public. I'm sure the slides can be shared later with links and everything. And I will save the questions till the end.
Thanks so much, Jing. That was awesome. Nicely done. So next up, we've got Jen. Jen, how are you doing in your high-tech room? There you are.
That was thwarted by a dead battery. I know. I'm doing all right. I'm just going to share my screen.
Perfect. Yeah, we can see it.
All right, great. Thank you so much for inviting me to join this group. I'm looking forward to speaking with everyone on the City of Kelowna's Natural Environment Development Permit area. I'm new to the city, so I have the luxury of have been having the luxury of learning about this over the past year and a half and seeing the benefits that have come from the long history of this permit area's implementation in the city. It's been in place for many, many years. It's been embedded in the official community plan of Kelowna, as I mentioned, for quite some time. And of course, we derive this authority from the Local Government Act, as well as the Riparian Areas Protection Act. As Jing mentioned, the City of Kelowna has chosen to beat or exceed the Riparian Area Protection Regulation requirements. So the province has delegated that authority to the City of Kelowna, which has a lot of really great benefits. To having that local point of view on the development process. And we're able to provide a higher level of detail on a lot of the protection areas. And I've just put up here a map of the Kelowna development permit areas for the natural environment. And we combine them for watercourses, sensitive ecosystems, sensitive drainage areas, and vulnerable aquifers. You can see quite a significant area of the city is covered by this, but I would highlight the aquifers layer is that horizontal green line, and that is covering a large portion of the community that receives their drinking water from aquifers in the Rutland area. Other areas, you can kind of tell where those drainage corridors and gullies and waterways are moving through the city, and that's where the DPA area covers. We also have worked with our partners regionally, particularly the Okanagan Conservation Collaborative Partnership, Scott, to do some work on creating biodiversity corridors and recognizing the work of the OCCP in helping highlight these important ecological areas. So we have two within the city, the one in the sort of darker gray green color along the outside edge, which overlaps with some of our DP areas. And then Knox Mountain is the green corridor in the upper lakeshore area. So you can kind of see how they don't quite overlap in some places. There's some gaps. So going forward, we're going to need to update our DP area to help highlight those connections. We base this information also on the sensitive ecosystem inventory that was done in the early 2000s to originally highlight the critical areas. And anytime a lot touches any of those critical areas, a natural environment development permit is triggered. So the other benefit to having more local enforcement of DP areas is that we have named all of our major waterways in our official community plan and listed out the riparian management area for all of those waterways. This is just a snapshot from our OCP from the list of all of the riparian management area setbacks from those waterways that development would not be permitted. So it ranges from 10 meters up to 30 meters in some places, and that's in relation to a very significant flooding risk around Mill Creek. We also have a 30-meter boundary along our wetlands that are associated with fish habitat, and a basic 15-meter requirement for any unnamed streams that might be that might pop up that weren't counted in the original mapping. So this is an example of the DP process in practice. This is a lot that natural environment development permit was required upon, primarily for wetland and waterways. The darker green areas up at the top, and they were identified through an environmental assessment that we required by a qualified environmental professional. We ask that the development applicant hire that qualified professional, and that professional is usually a biologist. but that biologist can then also engage with any other relevant professionals as needed. For example, if the connections with groundwater are an issue, bringing a hydrogeologist on board would be requested by the city of Kelowna to ensure that those connections are highlighted, both for the safety of development, but also for the protection of the watershed flows in that area. You can see on the right-hand side, the legend to this drawing. It's a lot of small text that's probably hard to read, but essentially this is the outcome of the process of assessment from the biologist, highlighting the environmentally sensitive areas within this lot. And it essentially created areas that were identified as very high environmental value and required that the developer move the proposed development area down towards this southern area of this lot and connect closer to the neighborhood, and then avoid those extremely high areas at the top. And essentially through the process, we identified that ESA 1 area could not be developed on. So we protected 37% of this lot through that process. So how do we guide that process? We have an environmental assessment terms of reference. We give that out to the biologist who is contracted to do the work on behalf of the developer. And we ask that they complete an inventory to let the land speak. Our staff here often go back to that point and encourage the developer to really understand the values on the lot, why they need to be protected, what the impacts of development might be on them, and prior to setting out building layouts and road layouts, understanding that inventory first. And as the inventory is completed, the environmental professional will create map polygons, as you saw in the previous slide, to identify those ESA 1, ESA 2, ESA 3, or ESA 4 areas. We would highlight that if there is ESA 3 or 4 areas on the lot, that's the best place to focus development on. We also have, as part of the terms of reference, the requirements for an impact assessment. And again, how that encourages the developer to look at the inventory and classifications of ESA areas, those environmentally sensitive areas, and then direct the development footprint around them. But it also includes the next steps for protection, mitigation, and compensation for however the development may impact that site. We have set a no disturbance goal for all of our ESA 1 areas. And unless the applicant can identify a very significant hardship, we stand pretty firm on that. We require no net loss of ESA 2 areas. So if a development will encroach on those areas, they will have to be compensated for at a minimum ratio of 2 to 1. So essentially for every 1 meter of encroachment, we're expecting 2 meters or 2 square meters of compensation. But we can ask for a higher level of compensation depending on the value of the environmentally sensitive area that's being impacted. And we would look to the qualified environmental professional to help provide a rationale for what the compensation ratio should be, and also how the compensation can be achieved. If it's in a site with an invasive species infestation, perhaps that's the best way to compensate, is to really do an intensive management plan for those invasive species, as opposed to just purely focusing on planting some new plants there. And lastly, the environmental assessment must include an environmental management plan and a monitoring contract. So we want to see a clear methodology, a clear schedule for when an environmental monitor will be on site to watch for any issues that may arise during construction and ensure the limits of disturbance are maintained through very clear boundaries, lovely snow fencing, as we're all familiar with, or flagging to protect vegetation that's going to be retained on site. And we often struggle with the loss of trees, for example, on that edge of the limits of disturbance because of the assumption that line is a hard and fast line, and it's okay to cut roots that cross that line. So we are trying to work on educating the community on protection measures that the environmental professional can provide to clearly lay out the root zone around the tree and what kind of fencing and protection are needed for that. So just getting through some of the benefits of that, the city having the opportunity to enforce our natural environment development permit area. We have a direct permit approval process through staff. It's clearly established, and we're resourced with 2 environmental coordinators here to help applicants work through quicker reviews. We have an application procedures bylaw that really lays out a clear process for receiving applications, the terms of reference for those environmental assessments, and then also the performance bonding requirements for ensuring restoration is completed and the plants are established. We also appreciate the opportunity as staff to review these permits because it avoids getting into the politics that can sometimes happen with council decision making. And we really point to the qualified professionals' rationale and recommendations to ensure that we're basing decisions on the best science and knowledge we have available. Getting back to Jing's presentation about layering, as we back up our development permit area with bylaws that allow us to ticket for offenses, particularly for tree removals in and around our natural environment permit areas specifically, and that allows a quicker enforcement response. And lastly, we do have a lot of our terms of reference separate from a bylaw to give staff the flexibility in determining what is required for an assessment. And for example, a groundwater development permit would only be triggered if the project involves digging or drilling for a well or geothermal. So we would then ask for an application that focuses on the hydrogeological assessment as opposed to the biologist's assessment. But we're still working on this process and learning as we go. We hope to update our environmental assessment terms of reference in the coming year and incorporate some new elements, especially being able to look to Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. And we also want to investigate how we can add stronger protections for grasslands and terrestrial ecosystems. Right now, it's very easy to point to the 15-meter RMA defined for all of our streams as a hard and fast line, but we don't have that same level of protection in our terrestrial areas. So looking forward to working with our partners at the OCCP on that one as well. And as Jing mentioned, we're updating our sensitive ecosystem inventory to help provide better data for our assessments. Our qualified environmental professionals rely heavily on the mapping data and provincial CDC data for their assessments. So we always have to hope that they're having access to the best data possible. And the last big project we're excited about this year is trying to improve our internal data on where ESA 1 and 2 areas are identified through all of this work, and have that incorporated into our mapping internally so that we have a living layer and a growing layer of information on our environmentally high value areas instead of a more static data set that only gets updated every 5 to 10 years. And that's it. And I guess I'll save questions for later.
That was awesome, Jen. Thanks so much. I really liked how you gave that level of detail about those tools. And I think it flows nicely from Jing's presentation about that, you know, the multi-tool kind of option. And yeah, it was great to hear. Thank you so much. So we're going to move to Scott now, and Scott's going to talk about his work with the OCCP.
Great. Thanks, everyone. I'm Scott Boswell, I'm the program manager for the Okanagan Collaborative Conservation Program. And I'd just like to mention that I'm coming to you from the unceded territory of the Silk Okanagan people who have cared for this land, the water, and all living things in this region for thousands of years. And I'd also like to note that this project is being co-led between Okanagan Nation Alliance and OCCP. So I put together a few slides basically going over the habitat connectivity project that we've been working on to show the importance of protecting biodiversity, talk about how we work with local governments and what we're going to be doing for the next 12 months. So for a bit of background, the RDCO started a research project with UBC and OCCP about 5 years ago. We looked at research that used computer modeling and mapping to predict animal movements and to help identify the major wildlife corridors in the region. Since then, we've hosted a number of workshops with over 20 organizations with all levels of government, including Okanagan Nation Alliance, West Bank First Nations, land trusts, and environmental NGOs to really start to narrow down which priority corridors we should be working on to protect, because they're the ones most likely to be at risk from urban and agricultural development. So one of the top projects that came out was the Okanagan Mountain Provincial Park Kalmalka Lake Ecosystem Corridor, connecting these two provincial parks. And this is just a map showing the 65-kilometer corridor starting in the south at Okanagan Mountain Park and going up to Kalmalka in the north. You can sort of see all the different land uses that vary from agriculture, rural residential development, crown land with provincial parks and rural parks, and a little bit of the West Bank First Nation IR. So the complexity of this led us to the decision that we actually need a really detailed action plan specifically for this corridor, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The major objectives of the corridor is to maintain connectivity between the two parks for the survival of much of the wildlife and biodiversity in our region. Is to protect the functioning ecosystems that provide our services, such as filtering our drinking water, providing pollinators for agriculture, and many others, and also to protect the indigenous cultural areas for hunting and food gathering. The picture in the background is part of Okanagan Mountain Park, which is about 110 square kilometers and provides a great core habitat for wildlife in the region. And part of our reasoning for maintaining connectivity between the two parks is that these parks, even though they have great wildlife values, they're not large enough to protect the ranges of many of the animals that are in there, and the fragmentation that's happening in our region is creating a need to actually work on connectivity for all our major provincial parks. Just a few slides, some bighorn sheep that are found in our region. Mission Creek provides a riparian habitat that intersects the corridor. This is the new regional park, Black Mountain, that's co-governed with West Bank First Nations. So there's great recreational values, biodiversity values, and also the opportunity for West Bank First Nation to hunt on the regional park. As I mentioned, there's tremendous pressure in the region, and you can sort of see the grassland between the hillside and residential development. And this is a pinch point for all grassland ecosystems that flow from the BC interior all the way down to the South Okanagan and into Washington State. So there's a number of groups that are working on this together because they realize this is such a pinch point and it needs to be protected. Just another picture of the grasslands looking south towards Kelowna. Some of the species, numerous species at risk that are found in the corridor. And then it ends in Kalmalka, which is the Kalmalka Lake Provincial Park and the area surrounding it. So there's been a number of partners that have been working on this project, and certainly the RDCO Parks Acquisition Fund, working with West Bank First Nation, has been a key player in securing lands along the corridor. The Central Okanagan Land Trust has a large parcel of land in the corridor as well. Friends of Black Mountain and South Slopes have been working with neighbors to increase education about the importance of maintaining that connectivity. Excuse me. The stewardship societies are working with private landowners, talking about best management practices. And the Mission Creek Restoration Initiative, which is a major riparian corridor intersecting the main corridor. It has a tremendous opportunity for our returning salmon, which in the last few years have included Chinook and sockeye for the first time in 50 years. So working with local governments, the team from OCCP, the province, UBC, worked with the staff of the District of Lake Country for about a year and a half through their OCP review process to really start developing stronger policies to protect connectivity, as well as getting them specific guidelines into their natural development permit area guidelines. On the map, you can see the orange area, which is the 16 the 16 kilometers of the northern section of the corridor, and it's 1 kilometer wide. This is the first major wildlife corridor to go into an EOCP at this scale in the province, and we're very excited about it at the time. Other planning tools that the district is looking at is soil and tree removal bylaws and increasing riparian setbacks. As you can see, the number of creeks that intersect the corridor, so any riparian setbacks would be a great benefit to the terrestrial ecosystem. We also spent about a year and a half working with the city of Kelowna with a number of the OCC partners, getting the major corridor, which you can see in the darker green, into their environmental development permit area guidelines, but also working, Jen had mentioned the other Knox Mountain corridor, which is a really key corridor to provide the wildlife benefits for Knox Mountain, which is a city park located right downtown and has great wildlife values. And it's a real gem of our city. But we need to maintain that habitat connectivity into the major corridor over a long time, just so that species can move and maintain their genetic flow over the long term. We're also working with our partners in the Washington State, with the Conservation Northwest Sageland Heritage Program, as well as the South Okanagan Smokeman Conservation Groups. And this map is basically showing pinch points throughout the Okanagan region that also need work, and probably priority corridors identified as well. We've been doing climate change modeling for the regions. On the left here, you can see our existing bioclimatic zones that range from grasslands all the way up to alpine ecosystems. But as we move to hot and wet in 2080, we basically are seeing grassland dominant landscapes. And what this will mean for habitat connectivity and wildlife, as well as our water and hydrology, will have a big impact of how we plan for dealing with these issues in the future. So we are doing more climate change modeling for wetlands and grasslands, and we're hoping to have that research out in the next 2 years. And we also spent the last year working with Okanagan Nature Alliance on hunters and community members to identify wildlife movements and to identify hunting areas, food gathering areas, and areas of cultural significance. And this information really showed the importance of protecting the upslope of the corridor and actually developing really solid actions to move us there in the future. So right now, we've been meeting with about 27 organizations over the last year. We've hosted about, I think, 11 workshops, and we're about to release a corridor action plan for this corridor that really focuses on silk-informed decision-making, land use planning, best management practices for agriculture, coordinated land securement, and outreach and education. And we're hoping to have that out in the next 8 weeks or so. And for anyone else who would like to just see the corridor, there's a link down here at okcp.ca if you want to watch it. This is a quick promo video we have. So that's all I have for now. It's a quick overview, and hopefully we have some time for questions.
Thank you, Scott. That was great. I mean, it's so good to see examples of implementation that span across different jurisdictions, right? So thank you so much. We've got a few questions that have popped up in the chat, so maybe I'll start with that. And here, let's see. There's one that for Jen around hardship. Oh, Scott, you can stop sharing your screen now if you like. So Jen, you mentioned, I think, hardship that fees would be waived or the process would be simplified. And someone's just wondering if you have any good examples of what that might look like.
Sure. We wouldn't necessarily waive the development permit. What we would do is work with the lot owner to see how the development can be sensitively integrated into the lot, and do its best to avoid disturbing the ESA 1 or very high value environmentally sensitive area. We do kind of follow that provincial guideline where I feel like it's like the 70-30 rule. I think there's also a 40-60 rule, depending on the amount of existing disturbance that's already within the lot. So if you can think of like a very narrow lot directly on the lake shore, we have an application in right now where I'm working with the owner to develop a really great green infrastructure plan or low impact development restoration plan to remove some retaining walls that are right on the lake shore, and really great to get some great like green shores style style shoreline restoration happening there. So we're getting a benefit, but potentially allowing the actual building itself to be within 10 meters of the shoreline.
Oh, excellent. That's a great example. Thanks. There's a question about protection of watercourses and setbacks on farmland. I know that I have a little bit of an answer to that, but I'm wondering if Jing, if you've got any ideas. You've certainly seen lots of tools out there. Just do any of them come to mind for you that might be of good use?
That's a great question, and that's something that we do see challenges with in our region as we speak. We know there are major shifts in the agriculture sector that is pushing that pressure up land in some of those critical areas that hasn't been touched. One of the things that we do have in place is the fact that we don't necessarily exempt development permit areas within the ALR per se. Obviously, farm practices have a certain rate associated with it, but we do still have a certain set of review through the development permit process for those projects in those areas, so that we take every opportunity possible to layer in protection measures where possible. But it is a great question. It is a challenge that we are working with in our region.
Yeah, for sure. And I know on my end, just in the consulting work that I've done, we've noticed that payment for ecosystem services can be a great sort of carrot versus stick approach for working with farmers. So helping them to identify what kind of ecosystem values exist on their property, working with them around restoration, and then helping them maintain that over time by having them like literally, come to the table and yeah, be brought on as partners through payment. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I have a question for Scott. I was wondering, Scott, how important, I know that there's a regional trust, I believe, like a fund that's been set up to help cover some of the costs associated with the corridor work. And I'm wondering just if you can talk a bit about that and how important that is to the work that you're able to do.
I think you might be referring to maybe the South Okanagan or the North Okanagan Conservation Funds. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you tap into some of those for the work that you do and how that works with your work.
Certainly, the only caveat on that is that those funds are designated for those regional districts. So this corridor doesn't fall within that. But certainly other local groups have been doing great work on basically all this type of protecting land securement, riparian restorations, all this type of work. And I know in the South Okanagan, the taxes, it raises about $450,000 a year for local groups. And in the North, it's about $100,000. Our dream is to actually get one in the Central Okanagan. And I think pre-COVID, we had discussions going. So we are about to do that again to drum up more support for it again and try to get one implemented here in Kelowna.
Excellent. That's great. Yeah, and I know the work that the District of Lake Country did when they set aside the protected area through their OCP, it was done fairly proactively, right? Because they were looking at land that hadn't yet been developed, but that certainly had development pressure on that. How critical is that sort of forward-thinking approach in ensuring that corridors can be protected? Because I would think that a lot of the land that would ideally be in a corridor might already be lost to development.
Yeah, we're fortunate with. Part of the reason to identify this corridor is because it's functioning as a corridor now. And so we just want to maintain it. So it's not about stopping people who are already there. It's so if they wanted to do more extensive agriculture, just to make sure that their fencing doesn't interfere with all the elk herds or anything like that that's moving on. So we actually work with the landowners to try to maintain connectivity as opposed to stopping development. But this corridor is sort of on the edge of the development zone for the entire region, which we're trying to, this is just the first step of protecting the corridor. It's not the end goal because it needs a lot more protection. And I think through land securement over time, that's the way to protect corridors.
Right. Interesting. Thanks. Question for Jen around the measuring piece. So the performance measures, you may have answered this a bit in your response there in the chat, but there was a question about what sorts of tools and targets the city of Kelowna can use to measure how effective and successful some of the policies and bylaws are. Is there anything that's being tracked specifically?
It's an ongoing question that we've been struggling with, especially each time we look at our official community plan, because we really would like to do a better job of finding a metric. It's just been a challenge to really find the resources to track and count which areas, because you can kind of do a very high level natural areas scan, but there's always little pieces of it like road crossings and things that make it really hard to do an accurate measurement. So kind of the way we're going is looking at a process to require the qualified environmental professionals to submit their mapping polygons as files that we can then upload into our GIS. And then eventually going forward, we'll start measuring those ESA 1 and 2 areas, and then connecting those with the covenants that are secured on those properties. And then we'll have a more concrete measure going forward.
Great. Jing, you've got your hand up. Did you want to take a stab at that too?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit to that. So part of the work that we are doing as part of our SCI update, or this iteration of the SCI update, is to actually identify and quantify what type of changes have occurred in those areas that's seeing development. I'm sure a lot of communities have seen this whole concept of no net loss or something along those lines, but we do know that development has occurred over the last decade. We do know that losses have occurred. And through this process, what we're hoping to do is actually quantify exactly what's taken place and have an idea, a more accurate measure of that, so that we could measure that against how our policies are doing moving forward. And maybe the goal is to drive for improved policy based on those changes. Great.
I've got a question about the use of qualified environmental professionals with regards to the development permit area process. My understanding is there was a recent court case with the Cowichan Valley Regional District whereby a QEP report was used to suggest that development could and should occur within a sensitive area. And when the local government, came and voted against that, it voted against the development permit despite that report, they were taken to court by the landowner, and the landowner subsequently has won. So I'm just wondering if that's resonating within local governments and what some of your experiences are working with QEPs, and how that can sometimes kind of come up against sensitive ecosystems, even though the QEP report suggests there won't be any negative impacts.
Sure, I can speak to that a little bit. That court case was interesting, and we talked a lot about it around my office, because by having our RMA areas, our setbacks designated specifically for each stream, we kind of felt like that would give us more standing in the court to say that 50-meter setback is established in bylaw. So the QEP couldn't really argue an encroachment within that. They could only argue a flex, what we term a flex, for compensation if they were to encroach within 10 meters of a 15-meter setback. We'd need to see that 5 meters multiplied by 2 or 3 in compensation outside of the RMA in other areas for that exchange. So we felt that that's the strength of having those riparian management areas set in OCP.
Interesting. I'm glad to hear that people are talking about that court case, because I found it very interesting. I have a question for Scott. If anybody else in the audience has a question, feel free to just put up your hand or interrupt me. Otherwise, I'm gonna keep going with my questions. Scott, I was wondering, like, from your perspective, if you could wave a magic wand, what would be some of the strongest or the best tools that you would hope to see local governments adopt to try and further some of the work that you're undertaking? Or another way of looking at it is sort of like, what's currently getting in the way of the work that you're doing?
A couple of things. Certainly, riparian setbacks is probably a nice, easy to understand project that we could all work on, but it's hard to implement new riparian setbacks. But certainly, they would have a huge impact on protecting wildlife in any region, I believe, because setbacks from a wildlife perspective should be 1 kilometer for most riparian areas. Like, if you want to protect biodiversity to its fullest, 1 kilometer, and we're in meters. But along Mission Creek, there are much larger setbacks, so there is opportunity for working on specific areas that we could focus on, especially Mission Creek in our region, land acquisition along Mission Creek, but also just working with working closely with local governments. I strongly recommend any local governments reaching out to their conservation organizations in their regions because they do bring extra resources to helping planners do what they really want to do. And we can actually be a voice to move the bar a little bit farther because we're an outside source. So I think there's opportunity for that as well. But waving my magic wand, certainly, I think we're very fortunate in the Central Okanagan to have a great planning team that's long-standing, but also we have a Parks Acquisition Fund, which is significant for our region, and it just leapfrogs you much farther ahead than most municipalities when you actually want to acquire specific properties or actually do really intense environmental planning. Just keep building on the tools that you have and working with as many partners as you can.
Great. There's a question here for Jen, going back to the terms of reference regarding contraventions, and wondering if there's guidelines on how to deal with that, and if the monitoring is left up to the QEPs or if staff also participate in that.
I just threw an answer in the chat.
Oh.
But yes, we rely on the QEP to submit monitoring reports. When the development permit is accepted, we request an environmental monitoring contract copy that's signed by the owner and the monitor to ensure that they are all on board to be a part of the process. And then we expect monitoring reports periodically through construction, and then annual reports after planting, if planting with restoration is involved with the permit, and that's connected to the performance security or bond that is also taken in at the time of permitting. And the city will hold on to that performance security until we have proof that the plants are well established. That's the wording we've tried to enforce in our bylaw, so that we could hold on to it for 3 to 5 years, because that's generally what we see in Kelowna. To have successful restoration come forward, it has to be well watered and well weeded for those first 3 to 5 years to get through our arid climate. And we do rely on those QEP reports, but if we receive any complaints or concerns, we will go out and inspect, and then staff do go and inspect at final reporting when the owner asks for their performance security back to confirm the QEP report matches what we see on the ground.
So there's a bit of an auditing process that occurs then, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've seen that similar approach in Maple Ridge, where they hold back some funds for a number of years until the trees especially are well established, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, I think those are all the questions that we had in the chat. We've got time probably for one more if anyone has one from the audience.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Thanks for the talk. And I had a few questions, actually. That's kind of short on time now. I just wanted to know if the local government folks, or know if it's a requirement for local governments, municipalities to uphold provincial and federal environmental laws and ensure that developers also uphold those on proposed sites outside of DPAs or otherwise, and also any suggestions on enhancing tree protection bylaws that are inadequate and don't fully account for biodiversity conservation.
I see Jing was kind of smiling to that. So do you want to take a first stab at that, Jing?
Well, it's outside of our jurisdiction to be able to enforce regulatory standards from higher levels of government. We do take every opportunity to communicate and coordinate between our regional partners. We work very closely with the ecosystem group in Penticton and in Vernon as well. We take, again, it's a collaborative process whenever possible, although we don't often have the stick to be able to enforce provincial or federal standards. In terms of, I didn't quite catch the second question, so I might leave that at that.
I think it was in relation to tree protection bylaws.
Tree protection bylaws.
Sure.
Yeah.
I can speak a little bit to that. The city of Kelowna is going through a process of updating its urban forest strategy. And we did recently update some of our tree protection bylaws that were already in place that protected trees in the Natural Environment Development Permit area or were protected in covenanted areas. No disturbance covenants and tree protection covenants are the main tool we use outside of the Natural Environment Development Permit area to protect trees that are highlighted as being significant. And we have focused on tree protection in those areas primarily due to the limits of capacity of the local government to be able to go on to individual properties and address tree cutting and removals. And the experience that I heard from interviewing other municipalities, especially those folks in the Lower Mainland, is that their time is often caught up in legal battles over individual trees on individual properties that don't necessarily have high value from an ecosystems perspective. So the general direction that we've been looking at here in Kelowna is focusing on protecting those corridors, the biodiversity corridors Scott outlined. And we've also established a permanent growth boundary for the city to further try and reduce development in those outer areas to really focus on protecting those trees adjacent to our natural forests.
Great. Thanks, Jen. That was a great detailed response. So we're just a couple minutes past 1 o'clock. I want to thank everybody for staying with us.